Start Hour 10. The U.S. government is the world's largest humanitarian actor, annually disbursing billions of dollars in life-saving assistance, food, water, shelter, emergency health care, and related protection support to tens of millions of vulnerable people. Funded by the U.S. Congress through the International Disaster Assistance (IDA) account, USAID pays for nearly half of the budget of the Nobel Prize-winning UN World Food Programme (WFP), as well as dozens of simultaneous operations that range from responses to hurricanes in Central America to tackling outbreaks of Ebola in Central Africa and caring for millions of people displaced by ongoing conflicts. USAID's emergency responses once were focused primarily on natural cataclysms such as hurricanes, floods, and earthquakes. Today, the agency spends more than 80% of its humanitarian budget on chronic man-made crises. Most of these emergency responses began years ago and absorb billions of dollars annually with no end in sight. Every year sees financial demands grow in response to new conflicts, most recently Ukraine. The budget of the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, BHA, has doubled compared to just a few years ago, and BHA can no longer manage its funds responsibly. A politically powerful foreign aid industry that benefits financially from extending and expanding these large-scale programs for years, even decades, ensures little scrutiny of these ever-increasing appropriations. The massive growth in emergency aid distorts humanitarian responses, worsens corruption in the countries we support, and exacerbates the misery of those we intend to help. The permanence of this assistance, particularly in countries where we have little to no in-country presence and must rely on UN agencies to self-monitor, has morphed into a co-governance scheme in which the U.S. government effectively finances the social services obligations of corrupt regimes that threaten the United States. These governments can then redirect scarce budget resources away from costly health and education toward financing their wars, supporting terrorism, repressing their citizens, and enriching themselves. Examples of this abuse are spread throughout the world. Over the past decade, the U.S. government has expended $14 billion in aid to Syria, where the bloody regime of Bashar al-Assad, a close ally of Iran and Russia, schemes nearly half of foreign aid through inflated official exchange rates, the diversion of food baskets to its military units, and procurement arrangements with compromised local contractors. Yemen, once the breadbasket of the Arabian Peninsula, is now dependent on billions of dollars of aid as formerly productive Yemeni farmers cannot compete against free food, while irrigation systems remain in disrepair, leaving the country to suffer from water shortages during long summer droughts and flooding during its rainy season. Iran-backed Houthi rebels divert substantial amounts of aid to support their war efforts in Afghanistan. The aid infrastructure built over 20 years of American military presence that 3 presidents wanted to end collapsed with the failure of U.S.-trained Afghan forces to repel the Taliban's 2021 advances. Yet the country has received nearly $1 billion more in U.S. humanitarian aid since the Taliban's takeover and absent a U.S. embassy to ensure that it is not diverted to the Taliban and other terrorist groups. In Burma, U.S. aid finances all of the food and medical care for hundreds of thousands of persecuted Rohingya that the military regime forces to live in open-air concentration camps. In northern Iraq, hundreds of thousands of Yazidis, targeted for genocidal extermination by ISIS, remain in miserable camps, unable to return home because of the Iraqi government's refusal to clear out Iran-backed militias occupying their homeland. In effect, humanitarian aid is sustaining war economies, creating financial incentives for warring parties to continue fighting, discouraging governments from reforming, and propping up malign regimes. Nefarious actors reap billions of dollars in profits from diversions of our humanitarian assistance, but so do international organizations. The WFP charges 36% in overhead, while Oxfam International's overhead has reached 70% in Yemen, reflecting the high costs of foreign staff, security, and logistics. With powerful lobbies in Washington, D.C., and in leadership positions throughout USAID and the Department of State, the aid industry adroitly exploits Congress's disposition to increase funding year on year to assist those in dire need, but provides no evidence to justify the mounting budget requests. In 2020, USAID's leadership fused formerly bifurcated food and non-food emergency relief operations into a single bureau for humanitarian assistance to improve the management of the agency's largest portfolio. But this reform was not sufficient to address the problem. The next administration should resize and repurpose USAID's humanitarian aid portfolio to restore its original purpose of providing emergency short-term relief, prepare vulnerable communities for transition, and do no harm in the following ways: work with Congress to make deep cuts in the IDA budget by ending programs that do more harm than good in places controlled by malign actors, such as in Yemen, Syria, and Afghanistan, where our aid is consumed by fraud, diversion, and partner overhead. Costs require USAID and the State Department to devise country-based exit strategies that term limit the duration of humanitarian responses and transition funding from emergency to development projects. This will require robust diplomacy to press host governments to integrate displaced persons in lieu of keeping them in expensive and dehumanizing camps financed by the international community, transition from large awards to expensive, inefficient, and corrupt UN agencies, global NGOs, and contractors to local, especially faith-based, entities that are already operating on the ground. This approach provides a far less expensive and more effective alternative for aid delivery. Local partners more ably navigate corrupt environments and are more likely to steer vulnerable populations away from dependence on aid towards self-sufficiency, require that BCA avail itself of existing IDA authorities that it fails to use, including to dispense with the cost reimbursement model that disqualifies undercapitalized local NGOs, accept other donor vetting of local partners, streamline the award approval process, and expand the use of fixed amount awards to rein in cost overruns. Direct USAID's Bureau for Management to hire more procurement officers for BCA to strengthen the Bureau's award management capacity and reduce the incentives to issue large awards to aid industry giants. Allow BCA to manage the process of hiring personal services contractors, require BCA's partners to adopt stricter vetting procedures to prevent aid from being diverted to terrorists, increase efforts to obtain greater contributions, not just pledges, for humanitarian operations from other donors, and make this a condition for receiving additional U.S. aid. Leveraging foreign aid to unleash the power of America's private sector. During the 1960s, when USAID was launched, 80% of financial flows from the United States to the developing world was in the form of U.S. government assistance. Today, that figure is under 10%, overtaken by private investment, remittances, and private charities, all demonstrating the power of America's private sector to promote wealth-generating economic development in poor countries. Leaders in the developing world routinely press U.S. officials about their preference for trade and investment, not aid. Instead, the Biden administration is leveraging private sector financing to promote its climate and other progressive agendas worldwide. The next conservative administration must return USAID to a foreign aid model that leverages its resources to promote private sector solutions to the world's true development problems and end the need for future foreign aid. Private capital investment in these markets is the greatest enabler of job creation and sustainable economic growth throughout the developing world. A key tool of American soft power leadership is the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, DFC. Launched in December 2019, DFC sought to unleash the power of America's private sector to advance our interests by providing emerging markets with blended financing opportunities to help end wretched poverty, create new markets for U.S.-made products, strengthen bilateral partnerships in strategic parts of the world, and offset China's predatory loans and investments. The Trump administration launched a USAID, DFC working group to maximize development outcomes and review individual investment projects through a counter-China lens and ensure a cohesive interagency development response. As development agencies, USAID and DFC must do a better job of aligning their respective activities and closely integrate both structurally and operationally. The easiest way to foster this alignment is to dual-hat the role of DFC's Chief Development Officer so that he or she serves simultaneously in both institutions. Like all U.S. federal bodies, DFC should be restored to its original intent of deploying its commercial risk-reducing financial services instead of its current misuse as another global vehicle to promote economy-killing climate programs, meet irrelevant diversity objectives, and over-focus on low-impact or misguided gender-based activities. Branding. A deeply embedded culture within the foreign aid bureaucracy views public recognition of U.S. assistance as secondary to a larger philanthropic mission and is embarrassed by the American flag. Citing vaguely defined security concerns, USAID's implementers, UN agencies, international NGOs, and contractors often fail to credit the American people for the billions of dollars in assistance they provide the rest of the world even as they engage in self-promoting public relations to raise other donor funds. This approach has negative foreign policy implications as China relentlessly promotes its own self-serving efforts to gain influence and resources. Worst of all, malign actors sometimes appropriate credit for unbranded U.S. assistance. Houthi terrorists, for example, claim to provide for the people under their occupation with anonymous U.S. humanitarian aid. The United States is in a struggle for influence with China, Russia, and other competitors, and American generosity must not go unacknowledged. The next conservative administration should build on the Trump administration's branding policy, which revamped ADS Chapter 320 to force the aid bureaucracy to fully credit the American people for the aid they are providing. The senior advisor for brand management in the Bureau for Legislative and Public Affairs, LPA, discussed infra, should be a political appointee who is responsible for maximizing the visibility of U.S. assistance by enforcing branding policy on every grant, cooperative agreement, and contract. The LPA should liaise with counterparts at the U.S. Agency for Global Media, USAM, to ensure local media pickup of these activities. Other offices and bureaus. Office of Administrator. The next conservative administration should leave in place the current structure of two presidentially appointed, Senate-confirmed deputy administrators, one for policy and one for management. The deputy administrators and the chief of staff must be individuals with extensive previous service in the executive branch, ideally at foreign affairs agencies, and be fluent in the language and practice of federal procurement. Bureau for Foreign Assistance. As noted above, the next conservative administration should name the USAID administrator as Director of Foreign Assistance, F, at the Department of State with the rank of Deputy Secretary. It should reorient the bulk of F staff from focusing on the formulation of the annual president's budget proposal to the execution of already appropriated resources. This should include eliminating the duplicative mission and bureau resource requests, speeding up the availability of appropriations by delivering to Congress within 60 days the report required by Section 653A of the Foreign Assistance Act, FAA, and fast-tracking the approval of congressional notifications, CNs, and other pre-obligation requirements. Management Bureau. As indicated previously, the next conservative administration should name a political appointee as USAID's Senior Procurement Executive and Director of the agency's Office of Acquisition and Assistance, M/OA. Political appointees with the appropriate credentials, including warrants, should be placed within M/OA, and the agency should exercise its authority to engage qualified experts from other federal departments and agencies and outside of government if they are free of conflicts of interest on the technical committees that review applications for USAID's contract and grant competitions. The administration should change the designation of USAID's competition advocate to an individual favorable to innovative types of contracts that can reduce the aid oligopoly's grip on the agency. Office of Human Capital and Talent Management. Vice of Human Capital and Talent Management. USAID's White House liaison must be an individual with substantial experience with federal personnel systems. The White House Office of Presidential Personnel should allow the USAID administrator to explore with counterparts at the Office of Personnel Management whether the agency could hire personnel under both the administratively determined authority and Schedule C of the Accepted Service of the Federal Civil Service. USAID should be one of the agencies to pilot test a reinstated Executive Order 13957/16 which created a Schedule F within the Accepted Service, and should aggressively recruit and place candidates into term-limited positions under Schedule A of the Accepted Service, especially veterans. The new CHCO should examine how the existing members of the Senior Executive Service, SES, at USAID should be reworked throughout the agency and should institute an SES mobility program to encourage the regular rotation of senior career leaders, including through details to other departments and agencies. Bureau for Policy, Planning, and Learning. The next conservative administration should shift the policy functions of the Bureau for Policy, Planning, and Learning, PPL, to the Office of Budget and Resource Management, BRM, located in the Office of the Administrator. It should rename BRM the Office of Budget, Policy, and Resource Management, BPRM, and staff the policy team with political appointees. The administration should also move the responsibility for reviewing and processing proposed changes in USAID's Policy Bible, the Automated Directive System, ADS, from the Management Bureau to the new BPRM. Even before these changes, the Assistant Administrator for PPL should decree an immediate freeze on changes in the ADS and agency-wide policy documents to allow for the priority publication of amendments to reflect the new administration's viewpoint. All major agency policies should be reviewed and amended or withdrawn within the new administration's first calendar year in office. Bureau for Legislative and Public Affairs. The next conservative administration should invest no more than 10% of USAID's allocation of administratively determined, politically appointed positions in the Bureau for Legislative and Public Affairs. A priority for these positions, combined with hires under Schedule A, should be the review and editing of the agency's public-facing web pages and social media accounts to eliminate material that does not conform to the new administration's policies. The agency should accelerate the review of congressional notifications within LPA and publish all CNs and congressional reports. To ensure consistency and clarity of public messaging, LPA should gain direct authority over the communications staff scattered through USAID's various bureaus and offices. LPA should expand its public-facing efforts to include conservative allies that are active in global development and humanitarian aid work, including industry groups, nonprofits, trade associations, foundations, and advocacy organizations, and correspondingly reduce the aid industrial complex's grip on USAID's corporate relationships. Office of General Counsel. Along with the Director of M/OA, the General Counsel is one of the 2 or 3 most important positions at USAID and should be a priority for immediate appointments. Because proper legal interpretation of executive orders and internal USAID policy is crucial, the next conservative administration should recruit and appoint a commanding team of Schedule C attorneys in the Office of the General Counsel, OGC. Within weeks of Inauguration Day, OGC should issue clear guidance on the eligibility of faith-based organizations for USAID funding. Office of Budget Resources and Management. The Director of Budget Resources and Management should be a political appointee empowered as part of the administrator's senior management team. BRM's highest priorities should be to prepare the report required by Section 653A, according to the administrator's guidance, institute a fast-track process for the submission of congressional notifications, and identify already appropriated resources to reprogram immediately to fund the new administration's priorities. The next conservative administration should consider prioritizing the placing of young political appointees in BRM over LPA. Bureau for Democracy, Development, and Innovation. A key outcome of the transformation of USAID undertaken during the Trump administration, the Bureau for Democracy, Development, and Innovation, DDI, is the home for most of the agency's non-health, non-humanitarian funding as well as almost all of its sectoral appropriations directives, including those that reflect the pet projects of individual members of Congress. The Bureau is the policy and financial nexus at USAID for most of the Biden administration's radical priorities in foreign assistance, including gender, climate change, and the promotion of identity-based politics. On the positive side, DDI is also the bureau in charge of areas that will be crucial to a reorientation of USAID, including trade, economic growth, innovation, partnerships with the private sector, and the agency's relationship with communities of faith. The next conservative administration should make the rapid staffing of key DDI positions a high priority. Besides the Senate-confirmed assistant administrator, the directors of each of the centers and hubs in the bureau will need political leadership. Almost every one of the agency-wide policies that cover DDI's areas of responsibility will need to be edited or rewritten entirely as soon as possible. The next conservative administration should harvest DDI's central appropriations to fund new priorities, especially working with ethnic and religious minorities and faith-based organizations and joint ventures with the private sector in education and energy. All DDI programs should issue funding opportunities restricted to new and underutilized partners modeled on the NPI. Regions Asia. Asia is the most populous continent and ground zero in the battle against communist China's efforts to exploit the development needs of poor countries for geopolitical gain. America's Indo-Pacific strategy should guide USAID's approaches to dispersing foreign aid in the region. USAID should intensify its bilateral relationships with free market Japan, Australia, South Korea, and India so that they can jointly advance private sector solutions to secure financing for power generation, infrastructure, digital connectivity, investment and trade expansion, and other economic activities. USAID enjoys a strong in-country presence in India, buttressed by recent coordination on the global response to COVID-19 as India is a global leader in vaccine production. Those ties should be expanded. So too should development cooperation with Taiwan, which boasts effective pandemic response capacity that should be shared with developing countries. China's island-hopping efforts to capture vulnerable Pacific states is a direct strategic threat to U.S. maritime supremacy and homeland security. And USAID and its allied donors should neutralize these efforts through the deployment of targeted assistance such as helping countries combat the effects of China's illegal fishing. While China outpaces the ability of the Democratic Alliance to deploy state-backed financing to developing countries, it is unable to compete with our collective private sector capacity to deploy trillions of dollars of capital. Pakistan is a prime example of foreign aid policies disconnected from U.S. national interests. The country has been the recipient of more than $12 billion in U.S. foreign aid since 2010, yet it remains intensely anti-American and corrupt, has backed the Taliban continuously since 2001, jump-started North Korea's nuclear bomb program, brutalizes its religious minorities, and is a willing client of China while taking on unrepayable loans from the U.S. taxpayer-funded International Monetary Fund and World Bank. Middle East. The Middle East is far more vulnerable today than it was in 2020 because the Biden administration strategy for the region is adrift. Tunisia has slid into autocracy, Iraq is plummeting further into Iran's orbit, and U.S. soldiers continue to risk their lives for unclear ends amid the ruins of Syria. Meanwhile, billions of dollars in U.S. foreign aid props up regimes allied with Iran. President Trump's Abraham Accord signaled the end of the centrality of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which paralyzed U.S. approaches to the region and focused instead on Iran as the principal threat to America from this region. During the Trump administration, USAID's allocations reflected the new opportunities created by the Accords and sought to strengthen regional alliances against Iran through expanded regional trade and investment and to promote genuine political stability tethered to strong American leadership. USAID formally partnered with the United Arab Emirates, Israel, Morocco, Qatar, and Kuwait to catalyze regional partnerships in Africa. Under the Biden administration, however, USAID has returned to a model that deepens the region's dependence on aid. A new conservative president should reset USAID's programming in the Middle East in line with our national security interests and committed to the goal of ending the need for foreign aid through development that is led by the private sector. Specifically, foreign aid must advance the Abraham Accords. Increased trade and investment between Israel and its Arab neighbors represent the most effective path toward reducing poverty, fostering the emergence of a middle class, and solidifying peace. USAID should therefore focus its development assistance on countries such as Morocco and Sudan through joint investment collaboration with the more economically advanced economies such as the UAE and Israel. USAID should consider cutting aid to states allied to Iran, limiting assistance in these countries to the advancement of narrow strategic priorities and support for basic American values, such as aid to persecuted religious minorities. USAID continues to expend hundreds of millions of dollars in non-humanitarian aid to antagonistic regimes in Iraq, Lebanon, and the Palestinian territories. After billions of dollars of aid and many years of effort, these countries remain hopelessly dysfunctional, a fact that exposes the failure of a foreign aid model that is disconnected to our national security and without exit strategies to promote self-reliance. We must admit that USAID's investments in the education sector, for example, serve no other purpose than to subsidize corrupt, incompetent, and hostile regimes. USAID should undergo operational changes to secure better development outcomes by reducing its missions footprints in the Middle East, given that most personnel in the region are unable to leave their highly protected and expensive compounds and carry out their oversight functions. It should redirect program funding away from expensive and poorly performing international partners to more cost-effective local entities that require a minimal USAID field presence. Africa. Since its inception, USAID has had a strong presence in Africa, saving millions of lives through its pandemic and infectious disease responses, especially for malaria and HIV/AIDS. It has led global efforts to provide life-saving emergency assistance to those who are fleeing conflict and suffering from devastating natural disasters. American generosity knows no equal. Yet the agency's efforts to reduce poverty and hunger have failed as it spends ever higher amounts of aid partnering with a costly and ineffective aid industrial complex that has little interest in working itself out of a job. Long-term, multi-billion-dollar humanitarian responses lack exit strategies, while numerous development projects lead neither to measurable results nor to government reforms. Despite the tens of billions of dollars spent, the continent remains poor, unstable, and riven with conflict, corruption, and Islamic terrorism. This situation has also resulted in vast illegal migration from the continent. Failure to generate wealth has provided opportunities for China to step in and become the continent's leader in trade, loans, and investment. As a result, Beijing controls most of the continent's strategic minerals that are critical to advanced technology. Moreover, USAID is criticized by Africans for exporting cultural values that are anathema to their traditional norms, further abetting Chinese continental supremacy. The Biden administration's radical global climate policies have cut off billions in investment to develop clean fossil fuels, denying Africa's billion-plus people access to cheap energy to further their own development and finance their own social services in health, water, education, and agriculture, while increasing its dependence on China's renewables industry. It has exacerbated hunger by increasing the costs of fertilizers to levels that many African farmers can no longer afford. Poverty-inducing dependence on aid grows daily. USAID efforts in Africa require rethink. In 2025, USAID will update its 5-year country development and cooperation strategies. This will give the next administration an opportunity to pursue a new development course for Africa that promotes economic self-reliance, catalyzes private sector solutions for job creation through increased trade and investment, terminates legacy and non-performing programs, and supports diversified energy approaches. Critically, it must hold China accountable for its extractive investments that violate international labor, environmental, and anti-corruption norms and practices, undercut business opportunities for U.S. companies, and sabotage Africa's development. USAID, in collaboration with the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, U.S. Department of State, U.S. Department of the Treasury, and U.S. Department of Commerce's Foreign Commercial Service, should use its convening power, diplomatic heft, and risk-reducing instruments to facilitate U.S. African business relationships and expand Prosper Africa, launched by the Trump administration to bring together services from across the U.S. government to help companies and investors do business in U.S. and African markets. The Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, AGA 18, provides Africa duty-free access to U.S. markets. The next administration should extend AGA beyond its 2025 term, but within a strategic framework that rewards good governance and pro-free market economic policies. There is no point in wasting massive sums of aid to countries whose governments fail to keep their promises to reform. USAID should build on, not compete with, private sector initiatives launched by global churches, corporate philanthropists, and diaspora groups that have already invested billions of dollars in self-reliance-based projects. Japan has committed $30 billion in aid to Africa over 3 years to stem China's economic and political grip on the continent. Gulf-based sovereign funds also are investing billions in African energy, infrastructure, mining, water, food production, information and communications technology, and other strategic industries. Other allied donors are promoting investment-based aid. There is no lack of funding to support Africa's economic rise. What is lacking is strategic direction among U.S. government foreign aid agencies. PEPFAR has saved countless lives over the years and constitutes America's most successful aid program. During the Trump administration, PEPFAR increased the share of funding to local entities from about 20% to nearly 70% with commensurate improvements that have had lasting impact. The next administration should extend that localization model to all global health and humanitarian assistance in view of how local African entities have strengthened their capacity for direct management of U.S. programs. Correspondingly, USAID should aggressively ramp down its partnerships with wasteful, costly, and politicized UN agencies, international NGOs, and Beltway contractors. All new programs in Africa should build on existing local initiatives that enjoy the support of the African people. Latin America. U.S. foreign assistance throughout the Western Hemisphere is designed to respond to national security threats that emanate from the region, such as illicit drug and arms trafficking, illegal immigration flows, terrorism, pandemics, and strategic threats from China, Russia, and Iran. Over the past decade, the United States has provided billions of dollars in security, humanitarian, and development assistance in Central America and the Andes, including $1 billion in food and non-food emergency aid to millions of Venezuelan refugees who have fled the Maduro dictatorship. USAID is always first to respond to natural disasters in Central America and the Caribbean and employs a network of dedicated experts in the region to deliver this assistance. During the COVID pandemic, the United States provided millions of doses of vaccines and other emergency health support. Yet years of foreign aid have failed to bring peace, prosperity, and stability to the hemisphere. Poverty, joblessness, and social unrest have led to leftist electoral victories from Mexico to Chile. These regimes are hostile to American interests and private enterprise, breed corruption, implement radical policies that will further impoverish their people and threaten their democracies, and are more open to striking partnerships with communist China. Left-wing authoritarian kleptocracies in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela deny their people basic freedoms, violently and ruthlessly suppress any dissent, repress communities of faith, and generate such misery that hundreds of thousands of their citizens have attempted to cross our southern border over the past 2 years. No recent administration has made any progress in reducing the chaos and desperation in Haiti. Conversely, Latin America is a major global source of energy and food, which generates substantial income that can finance internal social and economic development. The nations of the hemisphere share a natural and massive geographic trade and investment advantage through their proximity to the United States, supplemented by free trade agreements. The United States remains the favored destination for higher education and business opportunities for Latin Americans. Successful diasporas in the United States serve as powerful economic, cultural, and political bridges to every country in the region. The Trump administration focused on promoting trade and investment, especially in infrastructure, through an interagency effort called America CREASE, America Grows, by which USAID played a key role in providing technical assistance to create a more enabling environment to attract private investment. The Biden administration canceled the program. The next conservative administration should reassess all programs of U.S. foreign aid to Latin America and terminate those that have failed to achieve results after years of effort. Instead, USAID should focus its resources on strengthening the fundamentals of free markets, such as clear property rights and a functioning judiciary, and on promoting labor and pension reforms, lower taxes, and deregulation in order to increase trade and investment within the region and with the United States as the genuine path to economic and political stability. Challenge the socialist ideas that have captured too many of the region's governments and their nation's youth, fund partnerships with the private sector and support civil society groups, including university centers and think tanks that advocate for free market and democratic ideas. Finally, Latin America is the perfect proving ground for reducing USAID's reliance on large US-based implementers, and the agency should commit to shifting all of its portfolio in the region to local organizations by 2030. Personnel. The Trump administration agenda for USAID was undercut from the outset both by recalcitrant career personnel and by inexperienced political personnel. The next conservative administration should implement personnel policies from the beginning so that the agency can be effectively managed according to high standards. The rapid deployment of reforms will require key experienced personnel installed quickly at USAID's headquarters and missions. Delay will only impede progress. In general, areas of focus should be appointing effective lawyers in key positions, reforming career hiring/firing mechanisms, and getting a grip on the grant-making process. The administration should staff the Office of the General Counsel with at least 4 politically appointed attorneys, besides the General Counsel. The General Counsel should have 2 political deputies, one of whom should cover Human Capital and Talent Management, HCTM, and the other the Office of Acquisition and Assistance, OA. The administration should name a political appointee with long experience in federal personnel systems as USAID's Chief Human Capital Officer and Director of HCDM. This appointee would help to scope and shepherd position descriptions, clearances, and other components of the hiring process that are necessary for immediate onboarding while coordinating with the White House to bring in new appointees and make internal career employee changes. On day 1, USAID should halt all agency-wide training and replace it with training modules to advance the president's agenda. The administration should appoint a senior accountable official, SAO, to report on the agency's adherence to administration policy priorities, including on protecting life in foreign assistance, critical race theory, climate change, gender, and diversity and inclusion. It should also create a program to staff hard-to-fill positions overseas. Finally, the administration should create a recruiting program for veterans and other groups to participate in career job opportunities at USAID. Former missionaries, veterans, members of diasporas, and faith community stakeholders with overseas experience should be recruited to work at USAID on Schedule A appointments as institutional services contractors, as personal services contractors, and as foreign service officers. Conclusion. The next conservative administration will have a unique opportunity to realign U.S. foreign assistance with American national interests and the principles of good governance and more accurately reflect the U.S. taxpayers' unmatched charitable desire to help those in need. It can build on a strong baseline of conservative reforms undertaken by the Trump administration to counter Communist China's strategy of world domination. However, this will require that bold steps are taken on day 1 to undo the gross misuse of foreign aid by the current administration to promote a radical ideology that is politically divisive at home and harms our global standing. Page 283. Section 3. The General Welfare. When our founders wrote in the Constitution that the federal government would promote the general welfare, they could not have fathomed a massive bureaucracy that would someday spend $3 trillion in a single year, roughly the sum combined, spent by the departments covered in the section in 2022. Approximately half of that colossal sum was spent by the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, alone, the belly of the massive behemoth that is the modern administrative state. HHS is home to Medicare and Medicaid, the principal drivers of our $31 trillion national debt. When Congress passed and President Lyndon B. Johnson signed into law these programs, they were set on autopilot with no plan for how to pay for them. The first year that Medicare spending was visible on the books was 1967. From that point on through 2020, according to the American Main Street Initiative's analysis of official federal tallies, Medicare and Medicaid combined cost $17.8 trillion, while our combined federal deficits over that same span were $17.9 trillion. In essence, our deficit problem is a Medicare and Medicaid problem. HHS is also home to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, and the National Institutes of Health, NIH, the duo most responsible, along with President Joe Biden, for the irrational, destructive, un-American mask and vaccine mandates that were imposed upon an ostensibly free people during the COVID-19 pandemic. All along, it was clear from randomized controlled trials, the gold standard of medical research, that masks provide little to no benefit in preventing the spread of viruses and might even be counterproductive. Yet the CDC ignored these high-quality RCTs, cherry-picked from politically malleable Section 3, the general welfare, observational studies, and declared that everyone except children and infants below the age of 2 should don masks. Under COVID, as former director of HHS's Office of Civil Rights Roger Severino writes in Chapter 14, the CDC exposed itself as perhaps the most incompetent and arrogant agency in the federal government. Nor is the CDC the only villain in this play. Verino writes in Chapter 14, the CDC exposed itself as perhaps the most incompetent and arrogant agency in the federal government. Nor is the CDC the only villain in this play. Severino writes of the National Institutes of Health, despite its popular image as a benign science agency, NIH was responsible for paying for research in aborted baby body parts, human-animal chimera experiments, in which the genes of humans and animals are mixed, and gain-of-function viral research that may have been responsible for COVID-19. Severino writes that Anthony Fauci's division of the NIH, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, owns half the patent for the Moderna COVID-19 vaccine, and several NIH employees receive up to $150,000 annually from Moderna vaccine sales. That would be the same experimental mRNA vaccine that the CDC now wants to force on children, who are at little to no risk from COVID-19, but at great risk from public health officials. The incestuous relationship between the NIH, CDC, and vaccine makers, with all of the conflict of interest it entails, cannot be allowed to continue, and the revolving door between them must be locked. As Severino writes, funding for scientific research should not be controlled by a small group of highly paid and unaccountable insiders at the NIH, many of whom stay in power for decades. The NIH monopoly on directing research should be broken. What's more, NIH has long been at the forefront in pushing junk gender science. The next HHS secretary should immediately put an end to the department's foray into woke transgender activism. HHS also pushes abortion as a form of healthcare, skirting and sometimes blatantly defying the Hyde Amendment in the process. Severino writes that the FDA should reverse its approval of chemical abortion drugs because the politicized approval process was illegal from the start. In addition, HHS programs often violate the spirit, and sometimes the letter, of conscience protection laws. Severino writes that the HHS secretary should pursue a robust agenda to protect the fundamental right to life, protect conscience rights, and uphold bodily integrity rooted in biological realities, not ideology. Of healthcare, skirting and sometimes blatantly defying the Hyde Amendment in the process. Severino writes that the FDA should reverse its approval of chemical abortion drugs because the politicized approval process was illegal from the start. In addition, HHS programs often violate the spirit, and sometimes the letter, of conscience protection laws. Severino writes that the HHS secretary should pursue a robust agenda to protect the fundamental right to life, protect conscience rights, and uphold bodily integrity rooted in biological realities, not ideology. The next secretary should also reverse the Biden administration's focus on LGBTQ+ equity, subsidizing single motherhood, disincentivizing work, and penalizing marriage, replacing such policies with those encouraging marriage, work, motherhood, fatherhood, and nuclear families. If there is another department that has gone off the rails like HHS during the Obama and Biden administrations, it is the once proud Department of Justice, DOJ. As former counselor to the Attorney General Gene Hamilton writes in Chapter 17, the department has a long and noble history. Edmund Randolph, the first Attorney General, took office the same year as President Washington. Yet its long-standing reputation has been marred by the Biden administration's abuse of the department's powers for its own ends. Hamilton writes that the department's unprecedented politicization and weaponization under Biden and Attorney General Merrick Garland, resulting in politically motivated and viewpoint-based prosecutions of political enemies and indifference to the crimes of political allies, has made the department a threat to the republic. The most important thing for the next Attorney General to do is to refocus the department on its core functions of protecting public safety and defending the rule of law, while restoring its values of independence, impartiality, honesty, integrity, respect, and excellence. This is especially true of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's FBI. A bloated, arrogant, increasingly lawless organization, especially at the top, the FBI views itself as an independent agency that is on par with the Attorney General, rather than as an agency that is under the AG and fully accountable to him or her. To rein in this completely out of control bureau and reminded of its place within, rather than at the top of, the DOJ hierarchy, Hamilton writes that the FBI's separate Office of General Counsel, with approximately 300 attorneys, separate Office of Legislative Affairs, and separate Office of Public Affairs should all be abolished. Requiring the FBI to get its legal advice from the wider department would serve as a crucial check on an agency that has recently pushed past legal boundary after legal boundary. Indeed, Hamilton writes, he next conservative administration should eliminate any offices within the FBI that it has the power to eliminate without any action from Congress. Elsewhere, DOJ should target violent and career criminals, not parents, work to dismantle criminal organizations, partly by rigorously prosecuting interstate drug activity, and restart the Trump administration's China Initiative to address Chinese espionage and theft of trade secrets, which the Biden administration terminated, largely out of a concern for poor optics. It should also enforce existing federal law that prohibits mailing abortifacients, rather than harassing pro-life demonstrators, respect the constitutional guarantee of the freedom of speech, rather than trying to police speech on the internet, and enforce federal immigration laws, rather than pretending there is no border. In contrast to DOJ's long history, the Department of Education, the Department, or ED, discussed by Lindsey Burke in Chapter 11, is a creation of the Jimmy Carter administration. The department is a convenient one-stop shop for the woke education cartel, which, as the COVID era showed, is not particularly concerned with children's education. Schools should be responsive to parents, rather than to leftist advocates intent on indoctrination, and the more the federal government is involved in education, the less responsive to parents the public schools will be. This department is an example of federal intrusion into a traditionally state and local realm. For the sake of American children, Congress should shutter it and return control of education to the states. Short of this, the Secretary of Education should insist that the department serve parents and American ideals, not advocates whose message is that children can choose their own sex, that America is systemically racist, that math itself is racist, and that Martin Luther King, Jr.'s ideal of a colorblind society should be rejected in favor of reinstating a color-conscious society. The next head of this department will have a lot to do, hopefully culminating in the department's closure and the salutary restoration of educational control to states, localities, and parents. The next Secretary of Energy will similarly have much work to do. Under the next president, the Department of Energy should end the Biden administration's unprovoked war on fossil fuels, restore America's energy independence, oppose eyesore windmills built at taxpayer expense, and respect the right of Americans to buy and drive cars of their own choosing, rather than trying to force them into electric vehicles and eventually out of the driver's seat altogether in favor of self-driving robots. As former Commissioner of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission Bernard L. McNamee says in Chapter 12, a conservative president must be committed to unleashing all of America's energy resources and making the energy economy serve the American people, not special interests. In Chapter 10, Darren Bax writes that the Biden administration's Department of Agriculture claims to be transforming the food system as we know it. But the government does not need to transform the food system. Instead, it should respect American farmers, truckers, and families. In Chapter 13, former Chief of Staff at the Environmental Protection Agency Mandy Gunasekara writes that the EPA's current activities and staffing levels far exceed its congressional mandates and purpose, whereas its initial success in its infancy in the 1970s was a product of clear mandates, a streamlined structure, and recognition of the state's prominent role. Having since become a coercive agency full of embedded activists, its structure and mission should be greatly circumscribed. Former Secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development Dr. Benjamin S. Carson writes in Chapter 15 that HUD is beset with mission creep and regularly crosses the line into exercising quasi-legislative powers. In the next administration, it should refocus on its core duties and keep non-citizens from living in federally assisted housing, provide enhanced oversight of foreign ownership of U.S. real estate, and reinvigorate paths to upward economic mobility and economic self-sufficiency. In Chapter 18, former Acting Assistant Secretary of Policy at the Department of Labor Jonathan Berry writes that the department and related agencies should pursue pro-family, pro-worker policies to help restore the family-supporting job as the centerpiece of the American economy, in lieu of the current administration's left-wing social engineering agenda, the most assertive in history, which empowers race, gender, and climate change activists at the expense of American workers. In Chapter 19, on the Department of Transportation, DOT, former DOT Deputy Assistant Director for Research and Technology Diana Furch-Gottroth writes, in pursuit of an anti-fossil fuel climate agenda never approved by Congress, the Biden administration has raised fuel economy requirements to levels that cannot realistically be met by most gas-powered cars, thereby reducing Americans' freedom while increasing costs. Lastly, former Acting Chief of Staff at the Department of Veterans Affairs Brooks D. Tucker, echoing concerns expressed in other chapters, writes in Chapter 20 that the Veterans Affairs, VA, must be accountable to the needs and problems of veterans, not subservient to the parochial preferences of the bureaucracy. Department of Agriculture. American farmers efficiently and safely produce food to meet the needs of individuals around the globe. Because of the innovation and resilience of the nation's farmers, American agriculture is a model for the world. If farmers are allowed to operate without unnecessary government intervention, American agriculture will continue to flourish, producing plentiful, safe, nutritious, and affordable food. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, can and should play a limited role, with much of its focus on removing governmental barriers that hinder food production or otherwise undermine efforts to meet consumer demand. The USDA should recognize what should be self-evident. Agricultural production should first and foremost be focused on efficiently producing safe food. This chapter provides important background on the USDA and identifies many of the USDA-specific issues that will be faced by an incoming administration. It provides specific recommendations for the next administration about how to address these issues and lays out a conservative vision for what the USDA should look like in the future. Mission Statement. The current mission statement, as stated by the Biden administration, highlights the broad scope of the USDA to serve all Americans by providing effective, innovative, science-based public policy leadership in agriculture, food and nutrition, natural resource protection and management, rural development, and related issues, with a commitment to delivering equitable and climate-smart opportunities that inspire and help America thrive. The first part of the mission statement regarding the issues covered is not new to the Biden administration. It reflects the overly broad nature of the USDA's work. However, the language bringing in equity and climate change is new to the Biden administration and part of the USDA's express effort to transform agricultural production. The USDA's new vision statement illuminates the focus of this effort: an equitable and climate-smart food and agriculture economy that protects and improves the health, nutrition, and quality of life of all Americans, yields healthy land, forests, and clean water, helps rural America thrive, and feeds the world. This effort is one of a federal central plan to put climate change and environmental issues ahead of the most important requirements of agriculture to efficiently produce safe food. The USDA would apparently use its power to change the very nature of the food and agriculture economy into one that is equitable and climate smart. As an initial matter, the USDA should not try to control and shape the economy, but should instead remove obstacles that hinder food production. Further, it should not place ancillary issues, such as environmental issues, ahead of agricultural production itself. A proper mission statement. Even before the Biden administration's radical effort to reshape the USDA's work, the USDA's mission was and is too broad, including serving as a major welfare agency through implementation of programs such as food stamps. This far-reaching mission is not the fault of the USDA, but of Congress, which has given the department its extensive power. Congress must limit the USDA's role. A proper mission would clarify that the department's primary focus is on agriculture and that the USDA serves all Americans. The USDA's client is the American people in general, not a subset of interests such as farmers, meat packers, environmental groups, etc. The USDA's role. A proper mission would clarify that the department's primary focus is on agriculture and that the USDA serves all Americans. The USDA's client is the American people in general, not a subset of interests such as farmers, meat packers, environmental groups, etc. Within this agricultural focus, the USDA should develop and disseminate information and research the historical role of the USDA, identify and address concrete threats to public health and safety arising directly from food and agriculture, remove unjustified foreign trade barriers blocking market access for American agricultural goods, and generally remove government barriers that undermine access to safe and affordable food across the food supply chain. Core principles should be included within any mission statement, including a recognition that farmers and the food system in general should be free from unnecessary government intervention. Further, there should be clear statements about the importance of sound science to inform the USDA's work and respect for personal freedom and individual dietary choices, private property rights, and the rule of law. Taking these factors into account, below is a model USDA mission statement to develop and disseminate agricultural information and research, identify and address concrete public health and safety threats directly connected to food and agriculture, and remove both unjustified foreign trade barriers for U.S. goods and domestic government barriers that undermine access to safe and affordable food absent a compelling need, all based on the importance of sound science, personal freedom, private property, the rule of law, and service to all Americans. Overview: In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed into law the legislation that created the USDA. The department had a very narrow mission focused on the dissemination of information connected to agriculture and to procure, propagate, and distribute among the people new valuable seeds and plants. 5. During the last 160 years, the scope of the USDA's work has expanded well beyond that narrow mission and well beyond agriculture itself. In addition to being a distributor of farm subsidies, the USDA runs the food stamp program and other food-related welfare programs and covers issues including conservation, biofuels, forestry, and rural programs. Based on the USDA's fiscal year, FY 2023 budget summary, outlays are estimated at $261 billion. $221 billion for mandatory programs and $39 billion for discretionary programs. These outlays are broken down as follows: nutrition assistance, 70%, farm, conservation, and commodity programs, 14%, all other, which includes rural development, research, food safety, marketing and regulatory, and departmental management, 11%, and forestry, 5%. The USDA has provided a summary of its size, explaining, today, USDA is comprised of 29 agencies organized under 8 mission areas and 16 staff offices, with nearly 100,000 employees serving the American people at more than 6,000 locations across the country and abroad. Major priority issues and specific recommendations. For an incoming administration, there are numerous issues that should be addressed at the USDA. This chapter identifies and discusses many of the most important issues. The initial issues discussed should be priority issues for the next administration: defend American agriculture. It is deeply unfortunate that the first issue identified must be a willingness of the incoming administration to defend American agriculture, but this is precisely what the top priority for that administration should be. As previously discussed, the Biden administration is seeking to use the federal government to transform the American food system. The USDA website explains, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, alongside Biden, Harris administration leadership and the people of this great country, has embarked on another historic journey, transforming the food system as we know it, from farm to fork, and at every stage along the supply chain. The federal government does not need to transform the food system or develop a national plan to intervene across the supply chain. Instead, it should respect American farmers, truckers, and everyone who makes the food supply chain so resilient and successful. One of the important lessons learned during the COVID-19 pandemic was how critical it is to remove barriers in the food supply chain, not to increase them. The Biden administration's centrally planned transformational effort minimizes the importance of efficient agricultural production and instead places issues such as climate change and equity front and center. The USDA's strategic plan fiscal years 2022 to 2026 identifies 6 strategic goals, the first 3 of which focus on issues such as climate change, renewable energy, and systemic racism. In the Secretary of Agriculture's message, there is only one mention of affordable food, and nothing about efficient production and the incredible innovation and respect for the environment that already exists within the agricultural community. The Biden administration's USDA strongly supported 12 the recent United Nations, UN, Food Systems Summit. According to the USDA, the stated goal of the Food Systems Summit was to transform the way the world produces, consumes, and thinks about foods within the context of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and to meet the challenges of poverty, food security, malnutrition, population growth, climate change, and natural resource degradation. Not unlike those who oppose reliable and affordable energy production, there is a disdain, especially by some on the left, for American agriculture and the food system. The Biden administration's vision of a federal government developing a plan that fixes agriculture and focuses on issues secondary to food production is very disturbing. A recent USDA-created program captures both the disrespect for American farmers and the Biden administration's effort to dictate agricultural practices. The USDA explained that it was concerned with farmers not transitioning to organic farming, and therefore announced that it will dedicate $300 million to induce farmers to adopt organic farming. There was no recognition that farmers know how to farm better than DC politicians 16, or that organic food is expensive 17 and land-intensive. The Biden administration has also been pushing so-called climate-smart 19 agricultural practices, which received additional support in the Partisan Inflation Reduction Act. American agriculture should not need defending. According to the USDA's latest data, farm output nearly tripled, a 175% increase, from 1948 to 2019, while the amount of land farmed decreased. In fact, as farm output increased by 175%, all agricultural inputs increased by only 4%. In 2021, despite high food prices, a major problem and regressive, American consumers spent an average of about 10% of their personal disposable income on food, which is close to historic lows. For decades, this share has been in decline. America's farmers efficiently produce food using fewer resources, making it possible for food to be affordable. This reality is not only something that should be defended, but also touted as a prime example of what makes American agriculture so successful. The connection between efficiency and affordability seems lost in the Biden administration's effort to transform the food system. Recommendations. Proactively defend agriculture. From the outset, the next administration should denounce efforts to place ancillary issues like climate change ahead of food productivity and affordability when it comes to agriculture. Remove the U.S. from any association with UN and other efforts to push sustainable development schemes connected to food production. Defend American agriculture and advance the critical importance of efficient and innovative food production, especially to advance safe and affordable food. Stress that ideal policy should remove obstacles imposed on American farmers and individuals across the food supply chain so that they can meet the food needs of Americans. Clarify the critical importance of efficiency to food affordability and why a failure to recognize this fact especially hurts low-income households, who spend a disproportionate share of after-tax income on food compared to higher-income households. Secretaries have not used this power to any meaningful extent. This changed dramatically during the Trump administration, when this discretionary authority was used to fund $28 billion in trade aid to farmers, consisting primarily of the Market Facilitation Program. In 2020, this authority was used for $20.5 billion in food purchases and income subsidies in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. At the time, critics warned that this use of the CCC, which in effect created a USDA slush fund, would lead future administrations to abuse the CCC, such as by pushing climate change policies. Predictably, this is precisely what the Biden administration has done, using the discretionary authority to create programs out of whole cloth, arguably without statutory authority. 28 for what it refers to as climate-smart agricultural practices. The merits of the various programs funded through the CCC discretionary authority is not the focus of this discussion. The major problem is that the Secretary of Agriculture is empowered to use a slush fund. Billions of dollars are being used for programs that Congress never envisioned or intended. Concern about this type of abuse is not new. In fact, from 2012 to 2017, Congress expressly limited the Agriculture Secretary's discretionary spending authority under the Charter Act. And this was before the recent massive discretionary CCC spending occurred. The use of the discretionary power is a separation of powers problem, with Congress abrogating its spending power. This power is ripe for abuse, as could be expected with any slush fund, and it is a possible way to get around the Farm Bill process to achieve policy goals not secured during the legislative process. The next administration should refrain from using Section 5 discretionary authority. The USDA can address this abuse on its own by following the lead of most administrations and not using this discretionary authority. Promote legislative fixes to address abuse. Ideally, Congress would repeal the Secretary's discretionary authority under Section 5 of the Charter Act. There is no reason to maintain such authority. If Congress needs to spend money to assist farmers, it has legislative tools, including the Farm Bill and the annual appropriations process, to do so in a timely fashion. While not an ideal solution, Congress could also amend the Charter Act to require prior congressional approval through duly enacted legislation before any money is spent. At a minimum, Congress should amend the Charter Act to limit spending to directly help farmers and ranchers address issues due to unforeseen events not already covered by existing programs and that constitute genuine emergencies that must be addressed immediately. Prohibit the CCC from being used to assist parties beyond farmers and ranchers. Clarify that spending is only to address problems that are temporary in nature and ensure that funding is targeted to address such problems. Tighten the discretion within Section 5 and identify ways for improper application of the Charter Act to be challenged in court. Reform farm subsidies. Too often, agricultural policy becomes synonymous with farm subsidy policy. This is unfortunate because making them synonymous fails to recognize that agricultural policy covers a wide range of issues, including issues that are outside the proper scope of the USDA, such as environmental regulation. However, there is no question that farm subsidies are an important issue within agricultural policy that should be addressed by any incoming administration. There are several principles that even subsidy supporters would likely agree upon, including the need to reduce market distortions. Subsidies should not influence planting decisions, discourage proper risk management and innovation, incentivize planting on environmentally sensitive land, or create barriers to entry for new farmers. Farm subsidies can lead to these market distortions and therefore, it would hardly be controversial to ensure that any subsidy scheme should be designed to avoid such problems. The overall goal should be to eliminate subsidy dependence. Despite what might be conventional wisdom, many farmers receive few to no subsidies, 31 with most subsidies going to only a handful of commodities. According to the Congressional Research Service, CRS, from 2014 to 2016, 94% of farm program support went to just 6 commodities: corn, cotton, peanuts, rice, soybeans, and wheat, that together account for only 28% of farm receipts. Although many farmers do not receive much in the way of subsidies, especially those in the areas of livestock and specialty crops, fruit, vegetable, and nuts. 33. There are still a significant number of farmers growing row crops like corn and cotton that do receive significant farm subsidies. The primary subsidy programs include the Agriculture Risk Coverage, ARC, program, 34, the Price Loss Coverage, PLC, program, 35, and the Federal Crop Insurance Program. Farmers can participate on a crop-by-crop basis in the ARC program or the PLC program. These programs cover about 20 different crops. The ARC program protects farmers from what are referred to as shallow losses, providing payments when their actual revenues fall below 86% of the expected revenues for their crops. The PLC program provides payments to farmers when commodity prices fall below a fixed, statutorily established reference price. The Federal Crop Insurance Program is broader in scope than ARC and PLC, and in crop year 2019 covered 124 commodities. Farmers pay a portion of a premium to participate in the program. Taxpayers on average pay about 60% 41 of the premium. As explained by CRS, revenue protection was the most frequently purchased policy type in 2019, accounting for almost 70% of policies purchased, 42 while there are certainly other subsidy programs besides ARC, PLC, and federal crop insurance. One program that deserves special mention is the Federal Sugar Program. This program, unlike most other subsidy programs, intentionally tries to restrict supply 43 and thereby drives up prices. The program costs consumers as much as $3.7 billion a year. When it comes to reforming subsidy programs, the next administration will primarily have to look to legislative solutions. The next administration should champion legislation that would repeal the Federal Sugar Program. The federal government should not be in the central planning business, and the sugar program is a prime example of harmful central planning. Its very purpose is to limit the sugar supply in order to increase prices. The program has a regressive effect, since lower-income households spend more of their money to meet food needs compared to higher-income households. Ideally, repeal the ARC and PLC programs. Farmers eligible to participate in ARC or PLC are generally already able to purchase federal crop insurance, policies that protect against shortfalls in expected revenue whether caused by lower prices or smaller harvests. The ARC program is especially egregious because farmers are being protected from shallow losses, which is another way of saying minor dips in expected revenue. This is hardly consistent with the concept of providing a safety net to help farmers when they fall on hard times. The Congressional Budget Office, CBO, in one of its options to reduce the federal deficit, has once again identified repealing all Title I farm programs, including ARC, PLC, and the Federal Sugar Program. Stop paying farmers twice for price and revenue losses during the same year. Farmers can receive support from the ARC or PLC programs and the Federal Crop Insurance Program to cover price declines and revenue shortfalls during the same year. Congress should prohibit this duplication by prohibiting farmers from receiving an ARC or PLC payment the same year they receive a crop insurance indemnity. Reduce the premium subsidy rate for crop insurance. On average, taxpayers cover about 60% 47 of the premium cost for policies purchased in the Federal Crop Insurance Program. One of the most widely supported and bipartisan policy reforms is to reduce the premium subsidy that taxpayers are forced to pay. At a minimum, taxpayers should not pay more than 50% of the premium. After all, taxpayers should not have to pay more than the farmers who benefit from the crop insurance policies. CBO has found that reducing the premium subsidy to 47% would save $8.1 billion over 10 years and have little impact on crop insurance participation or on the number of covered acres. In that analysis, there would be a reduction in insured acres of just 0.5%, and only 1.5% of acres would have lower coverage levels. 50. This reform is basically all benefit with little to no cost. In its recently released report identifying options to reduce the federal deficit, CBO found that reducing the premium subsidy to 40% would save $20.9 billion over 10 years. Beyond these legislative reforms, the next administration should communicate to Congress the necessity of transparency and a genuine reform process. The White House and the USDA should make it very clear that the Farm Bill process, including reform of farm subsidies, must be conducted through an open process with time for markup and the opportunity for changes to be made outside the Agriculture Committee process. The Farm Bill too often is developed behind closed doors and without any chance for real reform. The White House, given the power of the bully pulpit, must demand a genuine reform process and express unwavering support for a USDA that shapes a safety net that considers the interests of farmers, while also remembering the interests of taxpayers and consumers. Any safety net for farmers should be a true safety net, one that helps farmers when they have experienced serious unforeseen losses, preferably when there has been a disaster or unforeseen natural event causing damage, and that exists to help them in unusual situations. Separate the agricultural provisions of the Farm Bill from the nutrition provisions. To have genuine reform and proper consideration of the issues, agricultural programs should be considered in separate legislation distinct from food stamps and the nutrition part of the Farm Bill, and reauthorization of such programs should be fixed on different timelines to ensure this separation. Agricultural and nutritional programs, which are distinct from each other, have been combined together for political reasons, something which is readily admitted by proponents of this log rolling. When it comes to American agriculture and welfare programs, they deserve sound policy debates, not political tactics at the expense of thoughtful discourse. Move the work of the Food and Nutrition Service. The USDA implements many means-tested federal support programs, including the largest food assistance program, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, also known as food stamps, and the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, WIC, food program. The Food and Nutrition Service, FNS, oversees these programs and other food and nutrition programs, including the Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion, 52, which handles the USDA's work on the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. Dietary Guidelines. Food nutrition programs include SNAP, WIC, the National School Lunch Program, NSLP, the School Breakfast Program, SBP, the Child and Adult Care Food Program, the Nutrition Program for the Elderly, Nutrition Service Incentives, the Summer Food Service Program, the Commodity Supplemental Food Program, the Temporary Emergency Food Program, the Farmers Market Nutrition Program, and the Special Milk Program. The next administration should move the USDA food and nutrition programs to the Department of Health and Human Services. There are more than 89 current means-tested welfare programs, and total means-tested spending has been estimated to surpass $1.2 trillion between federal and state resources. Because means-tested federal programs are siloed and administered in separate agencies, the effectiveness and size of the welfare state remains largely hidden. There are means-tested food support programs in the USDA, especially FNS, whereas most means-tested programs are at the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS. All means-tested anti-poverty programs should be overseen by one department, specifically HHS, which handles most welfare programs. Reform SNAP. Ostensibly, SNAP sends money through electronic benefit transfer, EBT, cards to help low-income individuals buy food. It is the largest of the federal nutrition programs. Food stamps are designed to be supplemented by other forms of income, whether through paid employment or nonprofit support. SNAP serves 41.1 million individuals, an increase of 4.3 million people during the Biden years. In 2020, the food stamp program cost $79.1 billion. That number continued to rise. By 2022, outlays hit $119.5 billion. The next administration should re-implement work requirements. The statutory language covering food stamps allows states to waive work requirements that otherwise apply to work-capable individuals, that is, adult beneficiaries between the ages 18 and 50 who are not disabled and do not have any children or other dependents in the home. Even in a strong economy, work expectations are fairly limited. Individuals who are work-capable and without dependents are required to work or prepare for work for 20 hours per week. The work requirements are then implemented unless the state requests a waiver from the USDA's Food and Nutrition Services. Waivers from statutory work requirements can be approved in two instances: an unemployment rate of more than 10% or a lack of sufficient jobs. The Trump administration bolstered USDA work expectations in the food stamp program. End hour 10. Start.